Russia has a serious alcohol problem, something that is effectively rotting the liver of the state. Which I know. Wow. Shocker. Yeah, Russia's war against Ukraine has led to a surge in alcohol consumption within the state, reaching 2.3 billion liters in 2023, something that mirrors Soviet era trends. And that is something that hasn't really gotten better. Alcoholism in Russia has reached a 9-year high in 2025, with 56.9 people per 100,000 being diagnosed with alcohol related disorders, despite government efforts to curb consumption. While formal retail sales of strong alcohol did fall in early 2025 due to rising prices because the Russian economy is not doing well, overall consumption of alcohol still remained very high, shifting towards cheaper alternatives, as well as a rise in black market illicit or even home distilled alcohol. This spike in alcoholism is something that correlates with an increase in violent crime all across Russia, with over 589,000 felonies in 2023, the highest since 2011. Growing alcoholism and crime fueled by war related stress and the return of pardoned criminals from Ukraine would go and contribute to a stagnant, apathetic society that poses some really serious risks to Russia's stability, on top of, everything else that has been going on. And my friends, if what it is that I'm describing here sounds a bit crazy to you, then you don't really understand just how closely intertwined alcohol and Russia are. There is a reason that so many jokes exist about it in the first place. Because in the vast expanse of Russian history, very few elements have shaped the nation's destiny quite like vodka. This clear, potent spirit isn't merely just a beverage in Russia, it's a cultural force. It is something that has influenced politics, economics, social dynamics for quite literally centuries. From the czars to modern day Moscow, vodka has been both a source of national pride and also a devastating social burden. It is something that has funded wars, it has toppled governments, and simultaneously it has served as the glue of social gatherings and the solvent of countless lives. But today, Russia grapples with a vodka problem that claims thousands of lives annually, and yet, despite that, it remains deeply woven to the fabric of Russian identity. Question thus becomes, how did this simple spirit become so inseparable from the Russian soul, and at what cost has this centuries long relationship come to at this point? Well, that is what we are going to be answering here then today on the History of Everything. Now, on our sister Pure History channel, History with Stakuyi, we did the early history of vodka in Russian politics, so there is no need to go back too far today. For more context, if you want, you can go and check out that episode because honestly, it's a really good channel. You definitely should go check it out. But at the time, we were in the 18th century discussing the 300-year history of the Russian czars, using vodka both for state revenue as well as for personal political gain. Now, what we're going to be doing to bring it more to the modern era to talk about the problems that Russia is facing in the current last 150 years or so, we're going to be jumping into the 1800s, where the Russian tax farm system was in effect. And this is really crucial to understand because this complicated system was, for the most part, the primary source of tax revenue for the Russian Empire of the 1800s. And guess what? A bunch of it surrounded vodka, a trend that would continue all the way through the 20th century and the Soviet Union. This is what I want you to understand from the very get go, my friends, before it is that we cover anything else. What we are talking about with Russia and its alcohol problem is not a modern problem. This is a cycle of dependency that spans literal centuries.
But speaking of things that create a lot of strong feelings here on the internet, today's video has been sponsored by Venice AI. And I know, hear me out, I know there's a lot of strong feelings regarding AI as already said, and I would never advocate that you or I use it to replace people from doing real work. I need to stress that my employees that support me and my channel are human, and they are also here in the United States. I do not abuse foreign cheap labor. That just needs to be said. Either way, I get the hesitation that people have with AI and feeding it your information. I mean, OpenAI has even hinted they may require government-issued IDs in the future. Would you feel comfortable giving your ID to use ChatGPT? Probably not, but that is where Venice AI can be such a useful tool to support you, as it is a private and completely uncensored AI. There are no content filters holding you back. You can explore any topic, ask any question. You can get a direct, unfiltered answer. It treats you like an adult who is actually capable of having a real conversation. But the best part of this, though, is privacy. Venice AI is completely private. Your chats and data are stored only on your browser, never on any of servers that they have. You can create, brainstorm, explore without a single worry about your data actually being tracked or stored. And if you go and pay for the Pro plan, you unlock advanced tools like PDF uploads for instant summaries, which for any student, researcher, or professional going through 200 pages of government documents can be a godsend. So that's what I'm advocating for. You can use something like this as a tool that is helpful. That is actually what I recommend, and you can do this by clicking my link down in the description and using my code History of Everything to get 20% off a pro plan. Or just try the free version. It's nice. And at this point, before the angry comments start swarming, thank you Venice AI for sponsoring me on videos that, again, regularly get demonetized because of the subjects I talk about, thus allowing me to pay my editor to feed his family, as well as even support my own. Back to the show.
So, to start then, going back into the 1850s, vodka would account for at least 200 million rubles in economic impact, or more than 20% of the value of all internal trade within Russia. And that's a really big deal. In 1859 alone, the government share of this huge turnover would exceed 120 million rubles, over 40% of all national revenues. Now, this huge sum was enough to cover most of the peacetime expenses of the army on which Russia's status as a great power depended, and already by the mid 19th century, Russia was basically trapped in a vicious cycle. It needed people to consume vodka in order to sustain its army, an army that was made of the vodka consumers, who, as will be shown later, had way more loyalty to vodka than to pretty much anything else in their lives, which is a problem. From 1805 to 1863, liquor revenue would average around 32% of all state revenue every year. That's huge. As a largely agrarian society, 19th century Russian farmers, which, if we want to say this, we're talking about probably the more wealthy ones, the more noble ones, they controlled the economy with the help of the government. Most efforts would thus center around vodka. The nobility would carry out all of the distilling in Russia, and they then had to sell their entire product to the government. The government, in turn, would resell all vodka at a very handsome profit to the tax farmers, who would bid on regional vodka trade monopolies at government held auctions every 4 years. The government would thus encourage potential bidders by providing official statistics that included the number of people that were living in villages, taverns, official vodka allotment, the value of government taxes, and prior years' alcohol sales figures, all in an effort to entice bidding and to get as much money as possible. The scale and overt dependence on distilled alcohol is, quite frankly, stunning, and it could only evolve in a relatively closed society with very little external trade, relatively little industrialization, and with huge numbers of peasants. Really, no matter which corner of the vast empire you travel to, the tax farm system was present. And this is something that led to the country having over 4,000 distilleries in 1860, and every single one was owned by the nobility, yet funded by the peasants. The worst part was that the tax farm system would lead to rampant bribery and corruption. Bribery existed before this point in time in Russia. Obviously, I don't really need to state that because it should be an obvious statement, but the tax farm system would crystallize it in Russian society to the point that it became just another part of life for the Russian people. Anyway, I'm probably going on about this a little bit too long. To make a very long and very complicated story short, the Russian nobility was bribing the ever loving crap out of the government, and this was due to the fact that the system required the tax farmers to sell at no profit the unfiltered and unflavored vodka known as polugar, or half strength, or 40% alcohol by volume, instead of the 80% that one could derive from double distillation. By law, 50 to 80% of vodka sold was supposed to be Polugar, sold at 3 rubles per bucket, with a 10 to 15% commission to cover costs. Profits were only permitted on Polugar sold above the government quota and on selling improved vodka, that being filtered through sand and flavored, also bought from the government. In order to avoid strict government laws about vodka strength, the tax farmers would simply choose to water down their vodka by up to 30% and then would pay bribes to government officials to simply look the other way so that they didn't really comment on the strength of the vodka that they produced being way lower than what the government mandated. Yeah, corruption in Russian society. Go figure. This meant that a lot of Russian tax farmers were making money illegally, and the bribes were simply given to allow them to continue to do so. As an example of the level of corruption, when Nicholas I called for a list of those governors who did not take bribes in the early 1850s, only 2 could be named out of 45. This bribery became so entrenched and socially accepted that the tax farmers even set up regular pay scales calculated by government officials and their positions in order to regulate and ensure that the person was being bribed with an appropriate amount of money. This meant that if you were trying to bribe a police captain, you could look at a handy guide that broke down bribery payments by government position, and you could be sure that you weren't being, overcharged for the bribery, that you weren't paying these guys too much money when their position shouldn't actually be worth that much. Yeah, because if you're going to go and bribe the governor, you're going to have to pay a lot more than if you're trying to bribe a average police officer or something like that. And because these bribes equaled about 4 or 5 times the average Russian bureaucrat's pay at the time, it's not really hard to understand how the system became so normalized. And so, because of this, here, my friends, decades of corruption would result in a significant number of enemies who were bitter at the money that they were not seeing themselves. Consumers who were forced to pay double, noblemen distillers who were forced to sell their product to the government at a set price, and central government officials who were aware of evil effects of monopolizing vodka business. By 1861, Alexander II had decided to abolish the tax farm system, and despite vigorous opposition from the tax farmers, the emperor was persuaded to change the law, which he did with great success. The new law would get rid of monopolies in both distilling and trading, and would establish a tax on distilling and licensing for alcohol trading, which were collected by officials who had nothing to do with the previous system, and were paid much higher salaries to try and keep them honest. And while, yes, most vodka related corruption ended, the government's own vodka revenues did not diminish. I know it sounds like I'm fixating on this a lot here, and I understand that, but this is just, it's so interesting to me because it ended an era of basically legalized government corruption. The new laws did away with the source of corruption, the tax farm, and it finally made government officials employees of the government and not the tax farmers. Because remember, the tax farmers were paying them like 5 times more than what the government actually was. So economically, the reform was equally significant because it redirected huge sums of entrepreneurial capital from a corrupt and unproductive form of enterprise into more productive areas. The millionaire tax farmers now had to invest their money elsewhere. They then became powerful bankers, railway owners, powerful capitalists. And in this way, it was actually possible to conclude that vodka made the emergence of Russian industrial enterprise possible in the first place, which is just wild to think about. Really, the government was so dependent on vodka revenues that it would circumvent its own laws and ignore abuses of production and inferior quality product coming from the distilleries by this point, simply because they did not want to lose tax revenue. Also, because people demanded their flow of vodka to not be interrupted. They really, really wanted it. But why was vodka so important to Russian culture, you may wonder? Well, one element of this concept is actually religious alcoholism. And I mean that in both seriousness and as a kind of joke. See, generally, peasants drank on 4 occasions: religious holidays, important family events, in extended hospitality, and in connection with a business transaction, something like that. The problem was that the practice of religion was closely tied to vodka, because to honor God, peasants drank. Moreover, Orthodox feast days would consume over 1/3 of the calendar. Yeah, like every third day was a holiday of some type, which meant, hey, that's going to be a lot of drinking. What's worse, the days before and after the holiday were also deemed to be like warm up and cool down days that also had to be observed with vodka. So remember, if you're talking about a third of the days already being religious holidays, then that means the day before and the day after, the remaining 2/3 were also the warm up and cool down. So it's light alcoholism, followed by heavy alcoholism, followed by light alcoholism again. And you just keep on following that same structure over and over and over again. In addition to religious alcoholism, private occasions such as marriages, baptisms, funerals, arrivals, and departures, all these things were marked by drinking. Peasants would spend staggering sums of money on equally staggering amounts of vodka. It was very common for the cost of alcohol for a wedding reception to be just as much as the amount of money that it took to hold the entire wedding and reception besides the alcohol. Clergy would even mandate for vodka to be drunk on days that it considered pagan in order to drink the evil away. This was drinking on another level. This wasn't even drinking for the love of the game. This was drinking ordained by God himself. And so, thanks to the crown, the tax farm corruption, and the clergy, the peasants caught in the middle developed lives that were dominated by alcohol. And most frequently, that alcohol in question was vodka. But even as I'm going and describing this, vodka's importance would extend beyond fellowship. The beginning and ending of any contractual agreements were marked with vodka. Other economic agreements, such as partitioning of forests, purchases and sales, debt repayment, all of this sealed with vodka. Vodka was also accepted as a form of payment for late debts and for actual labor, also known as pomosh, or help, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of. Essentially, pomosh was a highly popular way of hiring large numbers of men without actually having to pay labor wages. This practice was especially popular among wealthy peasants who could hire 20 to 30 men at a time for field work, and among young men of the village as they looked forward to heavy drinking once the job was done. Pomosh could be initiated any time of year, be it for springtime plowing or fall harvest or anything like that. Peasant hiring would go and advertise several days in advance and would oftentimes negotiate payment beforehand. And oftentimes, it wasn't just the men, entire families would participate, including women and children and the elderly. Everyone would participate in getting the alcoholics help in getting their fix. Along with that, the Russian military was also a big contributor to the love of vodka. Peasants would drink heavily before departure and then continue to do so while in service. In fact, vodka used to feature prominently in the ration of soldiers, where in the late 1800s, several studies would show that after a year, 83% of newly drafted soldiers were taking and consuming their vodka ration, and 27% were even drinking extra rations, which is up from 57% and 10% respectively that it had been in earlier years. The defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 is suspected by many to be owed to the excess of vodka among the troops, which not only impaired ability but decreased morale as everyone was just constantly drunk during the entire affair. At the end of the war, the military decided that it was actually a bad thing. They needed to give out only beer and wine instead of vodka because people still needed their alcohol, but the vodka was simply too much. And again, during World War II, the Ministry of Defense would give every Russian soldier on the front line a 100-gram ration of vodka, calling it the Commissar's ration. But we're going to be talking more about the Soviets later. Just you need to understand how closely intertwined all of this has been. It's always been there. In fact, going back a little bit, the Russo-Japanese War is possibly the most overlooked and underrated conflict in modern history. People just generally don't talk about it, and that is a shame. In nearly every way possible, it was a preview of the new way that war was going to be fought in the 20th century, and the use of large dreadnought battleships for the first time, the rise of an Eastern power that many had previously looked down upon as primitive, and the staggering loss of life were all things to look forward to in the following decades when World War I would throw everyone's ideas of combat and war upside down. But what else the 1904 conflict also exposed was the just sheer incompetence that was capable among Russian soldiers due to a couple of key facts. The first was that Russia was still using universal conscription. If you were an able bodied man, you very well might get drafted at any time that a conflict would arise. The other reason was that the military itself set up an infrastructure of supporting stores and supply depots to make sure that it could provide alcohol no matter what to an army that was fighting on the other side of Siberia. But to get both the supplies and the men to the most eastern reaches of the empire would take time, and the Japanese were counting on this. In 1904, the Japanese would attack Russia's far eastern outpost at Port Arthur, beginning the Russo-Japanese War, and what the Russians thought would be a quick victory, because, they were fighting a non-European foe, quickly turned into the most embarrassing debacle that they had faced in decades. At mobilization points across Russia, the call up of peasant conscripts would often turn into drunken and murderous riots. Pandemonium would frequently break out at these conscription points from men that were trying to not go to war. Many of them were drunk whilst making their pleas. Some men would loot taverns in a drunken desperation. Others would kill recruitment officers. Some even committed suicide rather than die on a frozen battlefield. That's how insane this whole thing was. In the railroad cars on the ways to Siberia, Russian soldiers effectively remained in a constant state of inebriation. Nobody even knew where they were getting the vodka, but they never ran out of it, all the way to Port Arthur. Now, before it is that we go and cover more of the Russo-Japanese War and its alcohol problem, we should also mention the man who sent those millions of Russian soldiers off to their snowy deaths, because in 1904, Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, which, yes, that is the Nicholas II that would rule all the way to the collapse of the Russian Empire. And we have covered before, and I think many people have talked about already, how Nicholas and his family would lose their lives over a decade later. At this point, Nicholas II was a firm believer in autocratic rule. He believed God ordained him to rule over the Russians, yet his time as Tsar was doomed to failure from the very beginning. Because, for starters, Nicholas was politically tone deaf and weak and indecisive. He frequently gave in to his three uncles, the Grand Dukes, in matters of policy. Even worse was the manner in which his rule began, because from a young age, Nicholas II was a drinker. Go figure, he's Russian. In his late teens, he was appointed to a junior officer commission and assigned to a part of the famous Hussar Mounted Regiment, where one of his Grand Duke uncles, Sergei, was his commanding officer. In garrison, the Hussars basically would party like rock stars and drink to excess at every possible opportunity. And Nicholas would be no exception. Uncle Sergei did nothing but encourage the young 25-year-old soldier to continue these days of excess. But then Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, would suddenly die of kidney failure at the young age of 49. Now, unfortunately for the Russian people, Alexander had expected to rule for decades longer and never really prepared Nicholas to rule when he was gone. And so, because of this, Alexander's brothers, the Grand Dukes, would have an oversized amount of influence on the young Tsar, especially in his early years of rule. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, currently the Governor General of Moscow, would hold so much influence that he is actually the guy who pushed the young Tsar to marry Princess Alex of Hesha in 1884. It just so happened that she was the sister of Sergei's wife. Go figure. This gave him even more influence on Nicholas. So when his older brother died in 1896 and he was in charge of Moscow, this left Sergei in charge of the coronation ceremony for his nephew and brother-in-law, the new Tsar Nicholas II. As part of the preparations, Sergei had introduced the novelty of electric lights to Moscow, and towards the end of the festivities, according to custom, every newly crowned czar would present gifts to the populace. This would be done at Kodnika Field on the outskirts of Moscow, which is where the distributions had been held since the coronation of Tsar Alexander II. Now, this choice was fairly questionable, as the field was normally used as a military training ground and was crisscrossed with ditches, but nevertheless, Sergei, as governor general, would approve the plans. Although a crowd of nearly 500,000 was expected from all over Russia, only one squadron of Cossacks and a small detachment of police were ever sent to maintain order. And so, early on the morning of May 30th, 1896, families began to gather at Kodnika Field, watching the carts laden with beer and wine passing through and onto the field. Everyone began drinking and celebrating, but soon drunkenness would turn into tragedy. Around 6 a.m., a rumor began to spread through the crowd that there wouldn't be enough alcohol for the nearly 500,000 people in attendance. And that, for the Russians, was the worst case scenario, as most of the crowd was already drunk and had been denied more alcohol. Shortly after this, another rumor began that the booths that were set up to hand out gifts to the crowd were already open and that the gifts were being handed out. This created a rush for the booths, and all at once the crowd surged in one direction, knocking down tens of thousands of people all at once. Men, women, and children by the hundreds began to be trampled underfoot, and no one could really help them. Some people never even fell and simply suffocated by the weight of the massive wall of humanity that washed over in one direction and then squeezed to death anyone who couldn't move fast enough. The police, simply far few in number, were helpless to do anything, as the Cossacks, even when they arrived, were unable to stop the catastrophe. As a result, 1,300 people ended up getting killed, and twice that number were seriously injured. Literally because a bunch of drunk people wanted to go and get gifts from booths, and they crowd surged. Like, it all surrounds alcohol. Grand Duke Sergei, who had organized the event, was seen mostly as responsible by the public, yet he refused all responsibility for the loss of life, passing on the blame to those under him and even trying to blame the chief of police, whose only crime was really not sending thousands more officers to handle the crowd. In the eyes of the public, and their opinion, Sergei had done himself great harm by not going to the scene of the incident or at least putting in appearances at the victims' funerals, and Nicholas, for his part, was distraught about the whole thing. None of this was his plan, and he knew it was a terrible way to start his reign. He wanted to cancel the remaining coronation activities and retire to a monastery to take up a life of prayer, actually. But his Grand Duke's uncle all said that such a historical event as a coronation shouldn't be marred by the deaths and maimings of a couple thousand people. So sadly, Nicholas caved to this pressure and allowed the events to continue and canceled out his life of prayer and penitent solitude. And even though he was intensely pressured by the public to resign, Sergei used his influence to have the Tsar fire the Moscow chief of police instead of just resigning his own position. Yeah, that is how that whole thing went. And I know we have a lot of background and a lot of other things to cover. This is just a taste of how things have kind of worked with vodka in Russia in history. So anyway, back to the Russo-Japanese War and how Russia lost it because of its obsession with vodka and drinking in general. Yeah. In the Russian military at the time, vodka rations were given on holidays and as rewards. The Navy was especially notorious for doling out vodka as it helped deal with the cold seas, something that no one really wanted to do. Ironically, most of the military leadership was against stopping the vodka rations as they believed it kept the soldiers happy and actually had health benefits. Despite some serious attempts to curb vodka in the military in the late 1890s, the fact was that vodka had been an irreplaceable part of the daily Russian life outside of the military, and so any and all attempts to curb the availability of vodka to the troops would fail. Despite the fact that contemporary research had suggested that 75% of all military ailments were caused by alcohol poisoning, and between 10 to 44% of all military deaths had been alcohol related, the military, and especially the Navy, refused to do anything about it. By the year 1904, while contemporaries widely regarded Russia as the dominant force in East Asia, Japanese power was rapidly growing. Both powers would prey upon the ailing Qing dynasty of China, and Russia was steadily eroding Chinese territory in the north, while Japan was waging war with China for control of Korea. Sustained Russian power projection in the east necessitated access to warm water ports. This was found at Port Arthur on the strategic Liaodong Peninsula, just north of the Korean border. By the late 1890s, Russia and Japan were at odds over territorial ambitions in this region, and Russian presence would gradually intensify in Manchuria and began to encroach on Korea in spite of Korea's position within the Japanese sphere of influence. So it was then, my friends, in February of 1904 that, breaching international etiquette that had been established by the Hague Convention of 1899, the Imperial Japanese Navy would go and launch a surprise strike against the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur prior to officially declaring war. Russia had previously sent troops to fortify and defend Port Arthur in 1898, so realistically, they should have been able to resist quite well. But let's take a quick look at the numbers here. Pre war, Russian military strength was around 1.16 million men, while the Japanese only numbered around 218,000. Furthermore, the Russian Navy possessed 64 warships, while the Japanese only had 34. And while Japanese military expenditure in 1904 far outstripped Russia's, this being $89.5 million to around $66.9 million, Russia exceeded Japan in industrial production. Now, this normally doesn't sound like it would favor Japan, but they had one massive advantage when it came to this battle: geography. The Japanese were incredibly close to Port Arthur's battlefields, while the Russians were literally half a continent away, depending on the incomplete Trans Siberian Railway, which only had one operational track at this time. At the same time, almost two-thirds of Russian warships were located in either the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea. Russia's Pacific Fleet was also then divided between the recently acquired Port Arthur and the traditional eastern base of Vladivostok. And so this, my friends, is when Nicholas II and his Grand Duke uncle, Alexei Alexandrovich, would come up with one of the craziest plans ever actually carried out in warfare. They wanted to reinforce their Far East Fleet by sending the Baltic Fleet under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rosnevetsky, and after a false start caused by engine problems and other mishaps, the squadron would finally depart on October 15th, 1904, and they would sail halfway around the world from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific via the Cape route across the Cape of Good Hope in the course of 7 months. This was an 18,000-mile voyage that would attract worldwide attention. And that is something that would prove to be one of the most disastrous naval voyages in history, as everything that could go wrong with the Baltic Fleet did go wrong. And I know this whole episode isn't dedicated to that. It's about alcohol, and you're going to understand why. First was the Dogger Bank incident on October 21st, 1904. This was when the Russian fleet fired on British fishing boats off the coast of England, thinking they were somehow Japanese warships. This naturally caused a major international reaction, as people were wondering, why would they think that the Japanese were on the other side of Africa waiting for them in British waters? Probably because the Russian sailors were near constantly drunk. Oh, but wait, it gets worse. Not only did they fire on British fishing vessels, but during the same battle, they began to fire on another part of their own fleet. Yes, they were firing on their own fleet for hours. In the end, 2 British fishermen would die, 6 more were injured, and 1 fishing vessel was sunk, and 5 more vessels were damaged. But on the Russian side, 1 sailor and a Russian Orthodox priest aboard the cruiser Aurora were killed by friendly fire, and 1 Russian warship would even fire over 500 times without hitting anything. Which, the thing that they were trying to hit in the first place, their mark, was, of course, a ship of their own fleet. What is actually insane is that if the Russian sailors hadn't been so incompetent and drunk, then more Russian sailors would have probably lost their lives that day due to friendly fire. They literally, the only reason that they didn't kill more of their own men is because of drunken incompetence. That actually is something that saved their life. Yeah. This led to an international incident and nearly caused a war with the British to break out, which was avoided by numerous public apologies from the Russians, as well as an international commission of inquiry, and Russia voluntarily paying out 66,000 British pounds to the fishermen. To make matters worse, the British would pressure the French and the Portuguese to not let the Russian fleet in their colonial ports refuel themselves, which would force the Russians to recoal in the open ocean or at anchorages, which was way more inefficient. Being denied docking at ports also exacerbated existing problems in the fleet, such as rotting food supplies, irregular mail delivery, and lack of shore leave. All of these, plus the long voyage, would further sap Russian sailor health and morale. So, for the upcoming battle, they would be facing the Japanese sailors who were well rested by contrast. Meanwhile, foreign correspondents were assessing the scene at Port Arthur as Russian soldiers began to arrive by rail. Now, again, at this point, you're probably wondering, Stack, why are you talking about this when the whole thing is supposed to be about vodka? Yes, I know, I know. Hear me out on this. The Associated Press correspondent Frederick McCormick, when he was writing about this, would first notice the grandeur of the Russian ships that were waiting at port. And, that was an absolutely awesome thing. The next thing that he noticed immediately after this was the massive mountain of probably 10,000 or more empty cases of vodka next to the train station. Vodka was found in the barracks, it was found in the officers' quarters, and even on the battlefield. Journalists would describe the entire conflict at Port Arthur like a scuffle between a drunken guardsman and a sober policeman. The front was even worse. At the disastrous defeat at Mukden on February 20th, 1905, Japanese forces proceeded to assault the right and left flanks of the Russian forces surrounding Mukden along a 50-mile or 80-kilometer front. Approximately 500,000 men were involved in the fighting, and both sides were well entrenched and were backed by hundreds of artillery pieces. After days of harsh fighting, added pressure from the flanks forced both ends of the Russian defensive line to curve backwards, and seeing that they were about to be encircled, the Russians began a general retreat, fighting a series of fierce rearguard actions, which soon deteriorated in the confusion and collapse of Russian forces. On the 10th of March 1905, after 3 weeks of fighting, General Kuropatkin would decide to withdraw to the north of Mukden. The Russians would suffer an estimated 90,000 casualties in the battle. This was already bad enough, but then on top of that, Russian military commissaries were afterwards instructed to destroy their stores of alcohol. But, being traditional Russians, they couldn't bring themselves to destroy it. So instead, they began to hand it out to the soldiers to keep in their hands and their winter caps, which then led to tens of thousands of soldiers getting absolutely loaded up with vodka while retreating, with some of them collapsing and dying in the cold snow before the enemy even reached them. When the Japanese did reach them before the weather took them, it wasn't really any better of an outcome. Russian newspapers would describe how, quote, the Japanese found several thousand Russian soldiers so dead drunk they were able to bayonet them like pigs, end quote. Yes, they literally walked up to the Russians and ran them through with bayonets with basically no resistance. This is how just deeply inebriated Russians were. I Now you understand why it is that I have to bring this whole thing up. After the Japanese had sieged and conquered Port Arthur, it was just a waiting game till the Baltic fleet would arrive and the outcome of the war could be determined. The Russian fleet would reach the Sea of Japan in May of 1905, and the logistics of such an undertaking in the age of coal power are ridiculous to imagine. The squadron required approximately 500,000 tons of coal to complete the journey, yet by international law, it was not allowed to coal at neutral ports, which would force the Russian authorities to acquire a large fleet of colliers to go and supply the fleet at sea. They had heard of the loss at Port Arthur while refueling in Madagascar, and Admiral Rostovinsky's strategy was to link up the Russian Pacific Fleet in Vladivostok. Unfortunately, to pool their forces, they had to pass by Japan and Korea. So by the end of May, the 2nd Pacific Squadron was on the last leg of its journey to Vladivostok, taking the shorter but riskier route between Korea and Japan, and traveling at night to avoid discovery. Unfortunately for the Russians, while in compliance with the rules of war, the two trailing hospital ships had continued to burn their lights, which were spotted by the Japanese armed merchant cruiser Shinano Maru. Wireless communication was used to inform Togo's headquarters, where the Japanese fleet was immediately ordered to sortie, and still receiving reports from scouting forces, the Japanese were able to position their fleet to cross the T of the Russian fleet And from here, the Japanese were able to engage the Russians in the Tsushima Straits on the 27th to 28th of May in 1905. The Russian fleet was virtually annihilated, losing 8 battleships, numerous smaller vessels, and more than 5,000 men, while the Japanese only lost 3 torpedo boats and 116 men. Only 3 Russian vessels managed to escape to Vladivostok, while 6 others were interned in neutral ports. After the Battle of Tsushima, a combined Japanese Army and Navy operation commanded by Admiral Katakal Shichiro would go and occupy Sakhalin Island to force the Russians into suing for peace. It was a horribly embarrassing affair, and this infamous Russian debacle, known as the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, would just show how incredibly incompetent and drunk the military was. Besides the poor planning, alcohol is blamed in equal share for the poor performance of the Russian military. Incredible amounts of alcohol were sent to the war. A 1905 article would claim that the government had sent over 10 million pounds of vodka for 400,000 men in 1904, and an additional 9 million pounds in 1905, averaging 25 pounds of vodka per man. This had caused whole units full of drunken soldiers, and numerous accounts of the Japanese simply being able to bayonet them because they were too drunk to fight. Other accounts would speak of quartermasters doling out vodka in ladles to soldiers that were too tired or drunk to fight. As a result of this debacle, the government had decided to hand out light wine and beer to soldiers because, quite frankly, they couldn't do it anymore. Now, sources do not agree on a precise number of deaths from the war because of the lack of body counts for confirmation. The number of Japanese army dead in combat or died of wounds is put at around 59,000, with an additional 27,000 casualties from disease, between 6,000 and 12,000 wounded. Estimates of Russian army dead range from around 34,000 to around 53,000 men, and with a further 9 to 19,000 dying of disease and around 75,000 captured. Really, the total number of dead for both sides is generally stated as being around 130,000 to 170,000. And that's really it. We don't know beyond that. Though there had been popular support for the war among the Russian public following the Japanese attack at Port Arthur in 1904, that popular support would soon turn to horrible discontent after suffering multiple defeats at the hand of Japanese forces. For many Russians, the immediate shock of unexpected humiliation at the hands of Japan would cause the conflict to be viewed as a metaphor for the shortcomings of the Romanov autocracy. This discontent would add fuel to the simmering Russian Revolution of 1905, an event that Nicholas II had hoped to avoid by taking, you know, a negotiating stance. To quell the uprising, Nicholas II would issue the October Manifesto, which included only limited reforms such as the formation of the State Duma, Russia's version of Congress. Yet these reforms also failed to fully address the societal problems of Russia at the time and really only delayed the inevitable Russian Revolution of 1917 by a dozen more years, which meant that over the course of the next decade, Nicholas II would hold on to power technically, but just barely. And then, in 1914, Tsar Nicholas II would make perhaps the worst decision that any Russian leader has ever made. He would prohibit the sale of hard liquors in Russia, including vodka. And the people of Russia would officially lose their shit. Remember, this is 1914. This is the same year that World War I breaks out. By early 1917, the Russian military had suffered catastrophic losses, around 1.7 million killed, 4.9 million wounded, and around 2.5 million missing or just taken prisoner, totaling around 9.15 million casualties. Mutinies would spring up more often due to simple war weariness. Morale was at its lowest, and the newly called up officers and commanders were at all times very incompetent. Like all major armies, Russia's armed forces had inadequate supply. The pre revolution desertion rate ran at around 34,000 a month. And it's at this point, that vodka made up a full third of the Russian Empire's income. The losses of World War I and the fall of the economy, the workers going on strike, the political agitation and rioting, all of this would eventually lead to the outbreak of the February Revolution in St. Petersburg in March of 1917. After the divisions and Cossacks of the city garrison had sided with the revolution, Emperor Nicholas II was left without a choice. At first, he abdicated to his son Alexei, but the sickly young prince would suffer from hemophilia and would not live long enough to have any form of stable rule. He drew up a manifesto naming his brother Grand Duke Mikhail as the next emperor of Russia, and Mikhail saw the whims of the people that would not allow the monarchy to remain, and he declined to accept the throne. So it is then, my friends, after the February Revolution, that Vladimir Lenin would eventually be placed in power and lead the Russian people. Lenin would retain the prohibition, which remained in place throughout the Russian Civil War and into the period of Soviet Russia and the Soviet Union. However, following Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin would repeal the prohibition in 1925 and bring back the state vodka monopoly system to increase government revenue. On October 4th, 1925, he would sign into law the authorization of the sale of 40% grain alcohol. Now, what was even worse here was that in the interim time between the revolution and Stalin repealing prohibition, Russian men had grown accustomed to drinking alcohol from other sources. Because remember, they were dependent on it at this point. So they were consuming mouthwash, toothpaste, cologne, even industrial chemicals, really anything to get their fix. The Russian cold provided unintended opportunities. Industrial chemicals, like solvents, were deadly to ingest. But if poured on steel chilled by winter, all the ingredients except for the ethanol would freeze into a ball, leaving pure alcohol for the lucky imbiber. Even machinery was used. A certain glue had alcohol content, as well as poisonous binders. Inserting a drill into the can and running it for a while would separate the alcohol from the gluey mass, which would encrust the bit. In the villages, fermenting pots of low proof hooch would stand in every hut. Sugar, yeast, water, and a barrel were enough to make an unpleasant beverage that the peasants would drink. Many had learned the method in labor camps. Out in the provinces, where there was beer, they couldn't resist strengthening it. For a few extra kopecks, 3 sprays of insect repellent were added to your mug. This would continue even up until the 1990s. Chocolates with a drop of liqueur inside were brought by the box and then consumed in haste. Men with international reputations for scientific discoveries and accomplished doctors would drink alcohol that was provided for the sterilization of laboratory tools with gusto. And drinking culture through the first half of the Soviet years, this is something that was encouraged from the very top by Stalin himself. Because you see, the Georgian revolutionary was a bit of a master of vodka politics like no other. See, Stalin was obsessed with rooting out and eradicating internal enemies. That much is obvious for anyone who is aware of history. And everyone but the leader himself was vulnerable to denunciation at any time for offenses against his regime. Yet, where alcohol served as a coping mechanism under Stalinism, vodka also served as a complex political purpose. As Heidi Brown would note, quote, during the Soviet period, vodka drinking was an important trust binder. Since vodka removes inhibitions, drinking made it easier to ascertain whether a fellow drinker was a government agent. End quote. For Stalin, vodka's utility as an unmasking tool was especially keen, because alcohol and the socialization into which consumption is inscribed was for him both personal and political. He could often hold large drinking parties at various homes, as well as smaller gatherings with his closest associates. And these parties would not only offer opportunities to unwind, they also offered a means of coaxing those in the dictator's inner circle to reveal themselves and others. Basically, Stalin liked to use vodka quite a bit, but perhaps the most famous Soviet drinking party would begin some 70 years ago, on the night of February 28, 1953, and would continue to the early hours the next day. At this point, Stalin's core group was down to just 5 people, including his short lived successor, Georgy Malenkov, and Khrushchev, the man who would actually eventually consolidate post Stalin power. On this night, as was common for such gatherings, Stalin would host a film screening at the Kremlin. After the film, the group would retire to Stalin's favored nearby home, affectionately nicknamed the Near Dacha, for dinner. And it was unlikely that this was a night of raucous partying, but by the time the group broke up in the early morning of March 1st, Stalin at least seemed to be happily drunk, by Khrushchev's account. And during the day that followed, Stalin, alone in his room, under the guard of subordinates who were too afraid of their own lives to go and check on him, would suffer a catastrophic stroke. When they finally summoned the courage to go in, staff would find him on the floor, unconscious, and Khrushchev and Malenkov would return, along with Beria, a longtime secret police official, but no doctor was summoned. This was at the height of Stalin's paranoia that members of the medical community were conspiring to murder Soviet leaders. Indeed, fervor over the doctor's plot is actually something that led to the widespread purge of their ranks. Once doctors finally did arrive, there was little that they could do. Stalin's brain had hemorrhaged, and he died from complications 4 days later. Now, did that change things when it came to drinking culture? Not necessarily. No, vodka culture and drinking in general would remain very popular in Russia throughout the rest of the Soviet years until Mikhail Gorbachev actually tried to institute prohibition again in Russia. On May 7th, 1985, the Council of Ministers of the USSR would go and adopt a resolution titled On Measures to Overcome Drunkenness and Alcoholism and to Eradicate Moonshine Brewing, end quote. The authorities were combating the rise of registered alcohol consumption from 1960 to 1980, and this figure, excluding moonshine, would increase from 4.6 liters to 10.5 liters per person. And yes, this is the official. Actual consumption was estimated at more like 14 liters. Mortality would rise from 6.9 deaths per 1,000 people in 1964 to 10.8 in 1984. The results of the anti alcohol campaign, though, were similar to those seen in all societies where prohibition laws were enforced: the emergence of an illegal market, organized crime, counterfeit products, and the proliferation of dangerous substitutes. Some individuals would even turn to other substances, narcotics. Moreover, the alcohol consumption model that had previously centered around wine and beer was disrupted. Between 1985 and 1987, sugar sales would actually rise by 18%, or 1.4 million tons. And you may be wondering, why? Why would this possibly be the case? Well, that is due to the increased demand for homemade alcohol, because you need sugar to ferment, to get that to happen. Additionally, there was an influx of goods, including windshield cleaner and laboratory grade alcohol that was used for cleaning instruments, leading to cases of alcohol poisoning and even death. In rural areas, home distilled spirits, called samagon, would become widespread, with about 23% of the population engaging in its production. Vodka in the USSR had always been expensive, as a significant portion of its price was due to taxes, because, that's where the government would actually draw a major source of revenue from. By 1989, the Soviet government, according to the then Minister of Finance, Valentin Pavlov, had lost out on 91.8 million rubles in revenue from alcohol, out of a total government income of 459 million rubles. That's like a quarter of all taxes. The economic losses to the state were one of the key reasons behind the discontinuation of the anti alcohol campaign in 1990. However, the restrictions would spark widespread public dissatisfaction, along with a recorded increase in drug addiction, substance abuse, bootleg moonshine production, and more. The economic losses to the state were one of the key reasons behind why things were eventually discontinued, but this would take a bit of time. The restrictions would spark widespread public dissatisfaction, along with a recorded increase in drug addiction, substance abuse, and bootleg moonshine production. Because of this, in October of 1988, it's only been like 3 years at this point, under public pressure, the anti alcohol campaign was effectively discontinued. Which, I say effectively, technically speaking, the restrictive laws would formally remain in effect until 1990. The public unrest and anger at the government at this attempt at prohibition would be one of the key underlying causes for the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Like, this is during a time in which things were already tenuous, and this just pissed people off even more. But most history books just don't even mention it. It's actually quite fascinating. Really, my friends, it's at this point that the Soviet Union finally collapses in 1991, and the new, more capitalist Russia would be led by Boris Yeltsin, one of the most notorious drinkers of all time. Genuinely, I mean, if I wasn't trying to go into all the history that I've done here, this whole video could have actually been about either just Stalin or Yeltsin and their alcohol-laden exploits, because my God, they did a lot. Yeltsin was elected Russia's president from 1991 to 1999. A young political prodigy, he had been one of the youngest provincial first secretaries, which is basically the Russian equivalent of a governor in Soviet history. He was appointed to govern over the city of Moscow with a population of 8.7 million at the time in 1985. And from all reports, he did a fairly excellent job. In late 1987, he would write a letter of resignation to Mikhail Gorbachev, claiming problems with the rate of change happening throughout Gorbachev's perestroika policies, and Gorbachev would ask him to reconsider. This shocked the world, as nobody had ever resigned from the ranks of the Politburo in the history of the Soviet Union. That's a big deal. Yeltsin chose not to resign, but a month later he gave a speech where he publicly disagreed with many of Gorbachev's policies and lamented the slow rate of social reform. Then Gorbachev called a meeting of the Moscow City Party Committee for November 11, 1987, to launch another crushing attack on Yeltsin and confirm his dismissal. That's how that went. On November 9th, 1987, Yeltsin apparently tried to off himself and was rushed to the hospital, bleeding profusely from self inflicted cuts to the chest. Gorbachev ordered the injured Yeltsin from his hospital bed, though, to the Moscow Party plenum 2 days later, where he was ritually denounced by the party faithful in what was reminiscent of a Stalinist show trial before he was fired from his post of first secretary of the Moscow Communist Party. Yeltsin said that he would never forgive Gorbachev for this immoral and inhuman treatment, and that is something that would set Yeltsin up to be a candidate for the people, one willing to risk his career and even life to actually make some change happen. He became a figurehead of anti communist opposition throughout the USSR. So it was then, on March 4th, 1990, that Yeltsin was elected to the Congress of the People's Deputies of Russia, representing Sverdlovsk with 72% of the vote. On the 29th of May, 1990, he was elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the RSFSR, although Gorbachev personally pleaded with the Russian deputies not to select Yeltsin. Then, on August 18th, 1991, a coup against Gorbachev was launched by the government members that were opposed to perestroika. Gorbachev was held in Crimea, while Yeltsin would race to the White House of Russia, which is a residence of the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR, in Moscow to defy the coup, making a memorable speech from atop the turret of a tank onto which he had climbed. The White House was then surrounded by the military, but the troops defected in the face of mass popular demonstrations. By August 21st, most of the coup leaders had fled Moscow, and Gorbachev was rescued from Crimea and then returned to Moscow. Yeltsin was subsequently hailed by his supporters around the world for rallying mass opposition to the coup, and this was effectively the last straw that would ruin Gorbachev politically. Taking advantage of the situation, Yeltsin began taking over what remained of the Soviet government, ministry by ministry, including the Kremlin. On November 6th, 1991, Yeltsin would issue a decree banning all Communist Party activities on Russian soil, and that was pretty much that. Now, Stack, you may be wondering, what does Yeltsin's story so far have to do with vodka? Well, perhaps I forgot to mention here that during nearly all the events just mentioned that Yeltsin navigated through, he was shit-faced drunk. Like, this man was a raging alcoholic who, in his moments of sobriety, was actually a fairly skilled politician. The problem was actually catching him sober. In 1992 and into 1993, Yeltsin had to deal with a constitutional crisis that temporarily caused the rise of two separate and parallel Russian governments that were vying for legitimacy. Yeltsin, though, giving absolutely no care whatsoever, decided to disband his own Congress and then hold a referendum for a new constitution, as well as a new parliament. This was the political equivalent of Yeltsin telling his enemies, "Look at me, I'm the constitutional crisis now." Between September 21st and the 24th of 1993, Yeltsin was confronted by popular unrest. Demonstrators protested the terrible living conditions under him, and since 1989, the GDP had declined by half, so this was a really big deal. Corruption was rampant, violent crime was skyrocketing, medical services were collapsing, food and fuel were increasingly scarce, and life expectancy was falling for all but a tiny handful of the population. Moreover, Yeltsin was increasingly getting the blame, and they weren't exactly wrong either. Russian life expectancy for men reached its lowest levels ever under Yeltsin in the 1990s, seen as Russians today as a kind of lost decade. At one point, the average life expectancy of a Russian man was just 57 years old in 1994. Now, official Russian data does not differentiate deaths by socioeconomic status, nor do they in the United States, but other evidence suggests that mortality rates would increase the most among the lower socioeconomic groups. For example, men with low levels of education were disproportionately affected by the increase in mortality. And this was one of the lowest life expectancies worldwide and worse than countries in places like Africa and South Asia. But it wasn't really Yeltsin's fault necessarily. The people would have suffered just as much under any other leader. Experts agree that the main reason for the drop in life expectancy was not because, oh, all of a sudden the government is killing people. It's because of the increased alcohol consumption between the years of 1989 to 1995 due to the severe instability in both politics and also the economy. Like, Russian men were so depressed at the lack of opportunity that they were literally just drinking themselves to death. As it turns out, once things began to improve in Russia towards the end of the decade and the economy began to improve, the drinking lessened overall and the life expectancy rose again. Surprise, surprise. Proof that it was related to alcohol consumption can be found when looking at the group whose life expectancy would suffer the most during this time: Russian men between the ages of 18 to 55 years old. They were the only section of the population to see the numbers plummet, and when conditions improved, so did the life expectancy of the part of the population that drank the most. Anyway, back to Yeltsin himself, though. By early October, Yeltsin had secured the support of the Russian armed forces and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And in a massive show of force, Yeltsin called up tanks to shell the Russian White House, his own government parliament building. This attack would kill 187 people and wound almost 500 others, but at the end of the day, Yeltsin retained and unified control of the Russian state. Now, there were times when Yeltsin drunkenness would lead to international incidents. During his first trip to Washington and D.C. in 1994, Yeltsin got shit-faced and was seen on a city street outside of the White House in nothing but his underwear. Secret Service agents would find him hailing a taxi and yelling, "For a pizza." They quietly would return him to his residence where guards mistook him for a drunken intruder. And on an official Moscow visit, Hillary Clinton once tried to keep her husband from drinking. Noting this, Yeltsin would instruct his staff to make private arrangements. He then took President Clinton to a Kremlin men's room where booze awaited them. Clinton and Yeltsin then returned, noticeably tipsy. The two men became great friends over time, and they met 18 more times, more than any other American and Russian presidents. One of the most famous incidents, though, would occur on September 30th, 1994, this being when Yeltsin was scheduled for an official state visit to Ireland. Unfortunately, by the time he landed in Shannon Airport, he was too drunk to actually stand, and his bodyguard would inform the pilots to begin circling the airport. After stalling for an hour circling the airport, the plane finally landed. Yeltsin's bodyguard and chief enabler then would inform the vice premier that he would have to conduct the visit in Yeltsin's stead. Upon being told that Yeltsin was unwell, Irish Prime Minister Albert Reynolds would then state, quote, "Well now, if he is sick, there's nothing we can do about it. But Mr. Yeltsin, my guest on Irish soil, and I cannot miss the opportunity to go on board the plane for 5 minutes and shake the president's hand and wish him a speedy recovery." End quote. Russians immediately rejected this proposal, and Reynolds was forced to meet with the Russian vice premier in an impromptu meeting in the airport terminal. After the meeting, which was supposed to be an all-day visit, Yeltsin's plane then departed immediately. The Irish, also famous for their drinking culture, would take offense to the fact that Yeltsin didn't get off the plane and just explain that he was drunk, to which they would have excused. Instead, the story of Yeltsin being unwell and unreachable for even a handshake rubbed the Irish the wrong way, and the term circling over Shannon actually became a term used in Irish society to describe someone who had had too much to drink. The political fallout from that was pretty bad. Mind you, while all of this was happening, Boris Yeltsin was undergoing quintuple, that's 5 times, quintuple bypass heart surgery, and rumors began to swirl that he was physically unfit to be reelected in 1995. His health, combined with the Shannon incident and the fact that he'd gotten Russia into a war in Chechnya, all combined to make him significantly more unpopular than he had ever been. His approval rating at one point was less than 4%. This was less than the study's margin of error. It seemed like there was absolutely no way that he'd win re-election, and then he actually shocked the world by giving up alcohol, promptly dropping 25 pounds, and then campaigning energetically, but most importantly, soberly. Pretty wild. In a masterstroke political move, while this was happening, Yeltsin secured an International Monetary Fund loan to Russia for $10.2 billion to keep his government afloat, and that loan helped him regain the backing of key financial supporters, and he managed to pull out a victory with 53% of the vote. Crazy, I know, but it's amazing what you can do if you aren't drunk all the time. Which, on that note, another aspect of the 1990s was the massive increase of illegal vodka production. Because the ruble had hyperinflated to the point of being near worthless, Russians were forced to make their own vodka. Distilling setups became common sights in Russian homes, and these moonshiners caused catastrophic losses to the legal and heavily taxed vodka trade. In fact, due to vodka taxes, illegal and unregulated vodka began being smuggled in from other countries. At one point, more than 60% of the vodka drank in Russia was from illegal foreign sources. This led to an 8 billion ruble loss for the state, who were taxing vodka with an 80% excise tax at the time. A Lancet study conducted years later found that during the calamitous 1990s, alcohol was the single greatest factor in Russia's mortality crisis, claiming over 425,000 lives annually. Over 50% of all deaths of working age Russians, that being from 15 to 54, was chiefly due to the use of vodka and other strong alcoholic drinks. Now, at this point, it was being combated. The second half of Yeltsin's term would see him clearer and more level headed, yet, he also set up Russia on the path to oligarchy, which would lead to more of its modern struggles. He ushered Russia through its most difficult time, and when the financial crisis of 1998 would hit Russia, his popularity would again take a dive. He was, at this point, getting older, and he knew his political life was coming to a close. On New Year's Eve, 1999, he would resign during his New Year's address and apologize to the Russian people for not making any of your and my dreams come true. What seemed simple to do proved to be excruciatingly difficult. Newly unearthed documents from the Clinton Library would reveal that Yeltsin was fed up with politics and wanted to resign his position back in 1998, but first he had to clear himself and his family from corruption charges. So, for better or worse, he left the country in the hands of a relatively low level deputy mayor from St. Petersburg, a former KGB agent who was notorious for turning a blind eye to blatant corruption charges. A fella by the name of Vladimir Putin. Yes, that is how Putin came into power. Interestingly enough, on this note, when we're talking about vodka and politics and how it's affecting modern Russia, before becoming president of Russia, the KGB agent Putin would reportedly joke that, quote, "There are 3 ways to influence people: blackmail, vodka, and threatening to kill them," end quote. While it is difficult to verify this quote, as the investigative journalist died in a suspicious plane crash days after the article's publication, It certainly does reflect well established tactics of international diplomacy. Blackmail is akin to economic strong arming, saber rattling is the threat to kill, and vodka is, well, I mean, that's the traditional thing for Russia. It's the traditional banquet, which can often enhance the other two. So, how did Putin do at leading Russia? Objectively, pretty bad. He seriously entrenched the country in the grips of a small group of oligarchs who do personal favors for him in exchange for his cooperation. And yes, while this is something that stabilized things in Russia, it created all the modern problems that they are facing today. And while today's Russians do drink less than they did in the 1990s, that's unfortunately not a very high bar to overcome. The city of Moscow alone gets through 2 million bottles of vodka every day. Annual vodka revenue in the capital alone is around $4 to $5 billion, and nationwide, the rough estimate is 6 billion to 8 billion bottles of vodka are drunk each year at a cost of $4 to $5 a bottle. 40,000 Russian men and women die every year because of alcohol related causes. And this, mind you, is low official estimates. Alcohol abuse is way too common and too much of a social embarrassment for the media to actually cover it. If they did, newspapers would be full of stories involving the pathetic antics of alcoholics, deadly counterfeit vodka being peddled on the black market, alcohol related crime, and entire villages being populated just by drunkards. This is the reality in Russia. In the past few years, the consumption of counterfeit alcohol was bringing epidemics of hepatitis in its wake. Alcoholics without money for official brands of vodka were looking for cheaper alternatives. Antifreeze, brake fluid, anti corrosion solution, aftershave, window cleaner, antiseptics, all these different things, cheap perfume even, were all being drunk. High ranking politicians suggested that a state run monopoly on alcohol was the best remedy for this. And while Putin didn't implement a full on monopoly over vodka production and distribution, he did the next best thing. He left it in the hands of his loyal oligarchs. One day before his formal inauguration, on May 6, 2000, Putin signed a directive that would begin the reconsolidation of Russia's top revenue generating industries. But Putin's first target wasn't oil or natural gas, or diamonds, or gold, or nickel, or anything like that. It was vodka. On that date, Putin created a new company called Rospetrom, an acronym for Russian Spirits Industry, to seize control of the means of vodka production. It was a move that not only helped Putin amass enormous wealth over the coming 2 decades, but was critical in a first step for cementing his grip on the Russian economy and the Russian people, who would help line his pockets while his vodka would help to ruin their health. Vodka facilities across Russia were taken over in the weeks that followed, stripping Putin's would be rivals, oftentimes powerful governors or mayors, of control over their regional budgets. More than half of the tax revenue for which was generated by vodka sales. Now, as for Putin himself, the man, amazingly enough, doesn't even really seem to drink alcohol. So, in a very funny turn of events, having Putin enrich himself personally by promoting the very vice that he privately avoided and publicly decried would be the height of hypocrisy. Yet, that seems to have been his plan from the very beginning, with the creation of his Rospetrom national champion company before his inauguration, and the seizing of the Crystal factory in the summer of 2000. And that is the way that things would pretty much proceed. During Putin's first 2 terms as president from 2000 to 2008, the hallmarks of what became known as Putinomics were political stability, steady economic growth, and bringing both political and economic power back under center. He created so called national champion companies, using the coercive muscle of the state to take over and consolidate entire markets under corporations in which the government controlled a controlling stake. Industrial giants like Gazprom or Rosneft would serve as natural gas and oil arms of the Kremlin, prioritizing the interests of the Russian state over actual functionality or profit. Putin's affiliation with vodka, though, is not just something that is financial. In 2003, a new brand would roll off the assembly line of the Crystal distillery called Putinka. Just as vodka is the Russian diminutive little water, Putinka is Russia's little Putin in a bottle, inspired by the cut rate vodka that flooded the Soviet Union in the early 1980s, affectionately dubbed Andropovka, after the geriatric Secretary General Yuri Andropov. The name Putinka was just different enough from Putin's surname to avoid legal infringement on his name and likeness, and Putinka would henceforth be the most important label to adorn the vodka bottles rattling off the Crystal assembly line. Putin controlled all earnings from Putinka, from trademark rights to the production and trade of the president's vodka, and it was just a big deal for him. Capitalizing on Putin's early popularity, Putinka was even dubbed Russia's super brand of 2004. With Cristal churning out more than 8 million bottles monthly, Putinka quickly became Russia's second most popular vodka brand, grossing some $500 million annually. The downside to such skyrocketing sales, though, was that Russian alcohol consumption and the alcohol related mortality, crime, and poverty figures that accompanied it would also remain alarmingly high, even as the economy continued its own steady improvements. Well, before, one of the things it is that I said is that Putin's time in office in the beginning was bad. And to be fair, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about things in terms of health and what would happen with the overall state because of it. It's not necessarily a fair statement because, objectively speaking, Putin's first two terms in office saw dramatic improvements in Russia for the economy. Like the Russian GDP in 2008 was triple that of when he assumed the presidency in 2000. This was something that was real. But public health statistics did not keep pace with the number of Russians dying just from alcohol poisoning, which was still 50 times higher than in the West. Russian public health officials would urge the adoption of even more rudimentary alcohol control policies, raising the drinking age, limiting the hours of alcohol sales, increasing penalties for selling alcohol to minors, clamping down on drunken driving, anything. Putin didn't really do any of that. And that is basically how things would continue for the next 2 decades. Fast forward then, and in May of 2022, 3 months after the beginning of Putin's disastrous and bloody invasion of Ukraine, the bottles of Putinka that rolled off the Crystal assembly line were emblazoned with the new patriotic pro war labels featuring Russian tricolor flags and the Latin letters Z and V, like those adorning the Russian tanks and APVs that were trundling across the border into Ukraine. All of it, every single bit of it, is tied together. And in the end, the crowning irony of Putin's reign in Russia, regardless of how it ultimately ends, is that Putin has become synonymous with the very thing that he actually does not like. From the beginning of his presidency, Putin framed himself as a fit, steady, and stable leader, in marked contrast to the inebriate bumbling of his predecessor. Yeltsin may have been a drunk and Putin sober, true, but Yeltsin's drunkenness was his own cross to bear. He never imposed his addiction onto his fellow countrymen. Putin, on the other hand, is only addicted to his greed, profit, and hubris. And that is why he keeps his countrymen shackled to his vodka bottle. In doing so, Putin has reinforced the use of vodka politics in Russia, not through his own drunkenness, but in a desire to keep his own people inebriated and thereby less powerful to resist him, as well as lining his pocket. Two things from here pose a massive threat to the future of the Russian people. The first, we've mentioned numerous times here previously. Their population is forecasted to crash in the next 20 years. And it's looking pretty unavoidable at this point, especially after the war in Ukraine. But even more importantly is the answer to the question, what does generations of fetal alcohol syndrome do to a population? For decades, Russia has actually had one of the highest rates of fetal alcohol syndrome in the world, rates as high as 99 children per 1,000. We are talking 10% have been reported to suffer from fetal alcohol syndrome. When discussing orphans, more than 50% of the orphans in Russia have been found to have fetal alcohol syndrome, giving Russia the highest rate of fetal alcohol syndrome in the entire world. It takes turns with South Africa to top that infamous list. Estimates on Russian women drinking during pregnancy puts that number at between 32 and 54%, which is a horrible number. That number of people harmed by the effects of exposure to alcohol in the womb has to take a toll on society. The stories of Russian soldiers doing atrocious acts in Ukraine, both under the influence of and in search of alcohol, though, is all the proof that one really needs to prove that those generations of fetal alcohol syndrome have caused something to go wrong in the mind of Russian alcoholics. Their love of vodka is not something that is dissipated, and until they seriously address this problem, their future is only going to continue to be run by and dictated by vodka politics. Whether or not that is going to change, though, well, it seems unlikely. With that, my friends, we're going to be ending things here. Thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Check out my Patreon if you want some further content, if you want to check out more of the stuff that I have on the History with Stakuyi page for the history side of things here. And with that, I'll leave you all here today. Thank you, my friends, and goodbye.